We have a new Django minor release and it's expected in August 2026. And that is Django 6.1 and the alpha version 1 is now available, and we're going to take a look at that in this video and have a look at some of the new features that are coming in version 6.1. So this is an opportunity to just try out a couple of the new features. We're going to dive in and take a quick look in this video. Before we get started, if you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page, and thank you to everybody that's contributed to that. It's much appreciated, and let's get started. So what we're going to do to start with is just start by having a look at what's new in Django 6.1. So we have the new features listed out here, and here we have the Alpha 1 release notes. And as it says, Django 6.1 offers a harmonious melange of new features and usability improvements. Nice language to describe this new release. And because it's released, we can install it. We're going to look at that in a second. But what is actually new? So first of all, we have these model field fetch modes. Now this is a nice feature that can prevent the 𝗫+1 problem when you're fetching related models in Django. So this on-demand fetching behavior of model fields is now configurable with these fetch modes, and they allow you to control how Django fetches data from the database when an unfetched field is accessed. And there are three fetch modes that are provided. The first one is called Fetch 1, and this is the default, and it represents the existing behavior in Django, and it fetches the missing field for the current instance only. The second mode is called Fetch Peers, and this will fetch a missing field for all instances that came from the same query set, and this is going to work very similar to prefetch related, but it's an on-demand version, and it can reduce these cases of 𝗫+1 queries without you having to maintain a list of fields to prefetch. So if we go to the bottom here, here's an example where we have a book model, and we call this function book.objects.fetch mode, and we set this fetch mode to the fetch peers mode. And then when you iterate over the query set of all the books and you access a related field such as author, this is not actually going to perform that extra query for all books found in the database. Instead, it's going to perform two queries. The first one will fetch all books. The second one will fetch all associated authors in a second query. We're going to see an example very soon in this video. Now there's a third fetch mode as well. It's called raise, and this is going to raise a field fetch block exception. And you can use that to prevent unintentional queries in performance critical sections of code. So we're going to take a look at these in this video. Another cool feature here are database level delete options for the foreign key.onDelete property. So this is a small optimization, but it's nice to have. When you have a foreign key and you specify the onDelete property, there are now database level delete options for cascade, set null, and set default. And these are going to handle the deletion logic entirely in the database itself using SQL's onDelete clause, and that's more efficient than using the existing Python level options. And that's because Django doesn't need to load objects before deleting them, so it is more performant. A nice optimization to have. We'll look at a very brief example of that later in the video. And a third new feature is the mailers configuration. So this belongs in your Django settings. And what it does is it supports configuring multiple email backends with different options. So this is a similar setting property to, for example, the caches property, databases, storages, and the new tasks property as well. It allows you to configure multiple backends essentially for emails. So here's an example where you have a default mail backend and it's set to Django's SMTP email backend. But you might have a second option here for marketing where you use a third-party email backend. It might be something like Amazon SES, for example. And what this is going to do is it's going to replace the email backend and related email settings in Django version 7.0 and onwards. These older settings will continue to work, but they will issue deprecation warnings. So if you're starting any new Django projects and you want to configure email backends and set up your email settings, you're going to use this setting going forward. Now these are the major features in version 6.1. You can see some minor features are listed below here. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a number of these features. If you're interested in any of these in particular, let me know in the comments. For example, we have some new stuff around the tasks framework, but these are just minor features, so we're not going to cover them in this video. Now I want to look at how you can install this Alpha 1 release. And I say that with this caveat, as it says at the bottom, the release is not for production use. This is for you to experiment with some of these new features and test things out. So if we go to the downloads page, and it's these instructions under option 2 to get the alpha for 6.1, you can run the pip install command and you can pass the -- pre option. And that'll allow you to install the pre-release. And if I open VS Code, you can see I've run this command and I've prefixed it with UV. So UV has this pip interface as well. and I'm installing the pre-release of Django, and you can see that version here, 6.1 alpha 1. So I'm using the 𝗬𝗱 command here. If you know of a different way to get these pre-releases with UV, let me know in the comments. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at the Django models that I've set up here, and imagine we have some kind of film-based application. We have a director model, and then we have a movie model, and the movie has this foreign key to the director table. So what we're going to do is try and fetch a query set of movie objects, and then try and access the director for each movie, and that's going to run into this 𝗫+1 problem, and we'll look at how Django's new fetch modes allows you to solve this. So let's open up the views.py file, and we have this Django view called movies, and it fetches all of the movies from the database, movie.objects.all, and it adds them to a context, and we're rendering a template here called movies.html. And if we look at movies.html, we iterate over all of the movies that we have in the context, and we render out the movie's title, and we render out the release here. Now there's no issues with this. If we go to the application itself, you can see we have all of the movies that I've set up. They're coming back and they're displayed on this template. Now I have Django 6.1 installed in this Django application. That allows us to profile the requests and different SQL queries that are being sent to the server. So if we open up this tab here, you can see everything looks fine. We have a request to this URL, and we are only performing one query to get all of these movies. And if we go to the SQL tab, you can see the query, for example. Now this becomes a problem though if we go back to this template, and for each movie, let's say we want to access the director's information. So I'm going to add a dash here, and let's just add the director's name. So it's going to be movie.director, and that is a related field on the movie. That's the foreign key, and we can get the name of the director using the .name property. So we essentially follow a relation here to get the director, but if we're not prefetching or joining in the database to get the associated directors, this is going to issue another query for every single movie in our query set. So let's save this and go back to the page, and we're going to refresh this page, and now we can see the directors for each movie. If we go back to Django 6.1 and go back to the request tab, you can see this time we have something slightly different. We're issuing 12 queries to the database instead of 1. Now this is not a problem for a small database like this one, but it will become a problem as your application grows, and the reason for that is because we are running into this 𝗫+1 problem. So for example, if we look at these queries, we can select the initial query that gives us all movies in the database. But then for all of those movies, we are sending another query to the database, and we're performing this filter here on the where clause to get the director with the ID of 3. And that's because the movie that we're looking at in that iteration of the for loop in the template has a director with this ID, and Django then has to go and look that up in the database, and it has to do it for every single movie in the query set. So that is not ideal, and traditionally you would solve this using the select related function, but let's now see how to do it using the new fetch modes in Django. So rather than just calling .all here, we can use this new method called fetch mode, and we're going to set the fetch mode to something from Django's models. So let's import that, and it's going to be models.fetch_peers. And implicitly behind the scenes, this is going to get all rows from the database as well. So we can chain .all if you want onto that, but we don't strictly need to, so I'm not going to do it. Let's now save this and go back to the application and refresh this page. Now we get the same results on the page, but what happens if we go to Django 6.1 and if we look at the queries, you can see here we are issuing 2 queries just by making that one change. So instead of 12 queries, 2 queries are being sent to the database. That's going to be better for performance. It's less network round trips to the database server and so on. And if we look at the queries that have actually been sent on this SQL tab, we have the same initial query to get all of the movies from the database. The second query though is going to get all of the directors that are part of the IDs that are fetched in that initial movie query set. So when you fetch that set of movies, you can see here we have the foreign keys in that movie table for the associated director. And what Django is going to do when you set to fetch peers is it's going to look at all of the distinct IDs in that foreign key column, and it's then going to issue a subsequent query to get all of the directors in this case that have an ID in that set. So this is functionally similar to the prefetch related function that you might be familiar with. And if you want to know more about that function and select related in Django, I'll leave a link just below this video to those. And we don't need to maintain a list of fields here. So for example, if we change this up to use the select related function, we would need to maintain that set of fields. For example, in this case, it would be the director field. We could then save that, go back to the application, and it's still going to work. And if we go back to Django Silk, we're going to see something slightly different for this request. Instead of 2 queries, we were able to get them in 1 query. And that's because when you use select related in the underlying database, it's doing a join. And it can return everything in a single query, whereas with prefetch related, it's going to have to do an additional query for your related models. So I think this new method of fetching objects is quite a nice addition to Django, and it gives you some safety by making sure that when you do reference a related field, you're not going to fall into the trap of this n+1 problem, and that might be good for performance in your application. Now there was one other mode here. If we go back to the documentation, it was called raise. So if we copy that and go back here, let's paste that in. And what this is going to do is it's going to raise an error if you try and reference a related field. So if we go to movies.html, we're trying to access the director's name. That is going to cause a problem. Let's go back to the application and refresh this page. And this time we see this field fetch blocked exception. And the message here tells us that the fetching of movie.director is blocked. So you can use this to prevent that n+1 problem in a different way. Rather than prefetching the related objects, this is actually going to block you from accessing those objects. And one last thing to show on these fetch modes, if we go back to the documentation, I'm going to go to this new page in the Django docs. So there is a dedicated page here on when you can use this, and these fetch modes, they apply to foreign keys and one-to-one fields, as well as the reverse accessors, and also on fields that are deferred using the defer and only methods on query sets. Now one thing I want to highlight before we move on here, let's scroll to the bottom. If you want to make a particular fetch mode the default for a model class, you can do so. And you do that using a custom manager that overrides getQuerySet. So you can see here a book manager, and we override the getQuerySet method. And then that just returns the super.getQuerySet, but it sets that fetch mode to, for example, fetch peers. And then inside your book model itself, you can set objects to the overridden manager, and that's going to then make this the default fetch mode for your book queries. So that's a little bit on fetch modes. I'm going to go back to the documentation, and while we have this foreign key, let's just quickly show the DB cascade option. So if we go back to the application's models.py, here we have this foreign key on line 13. And on delete, we have this set to models.cascade. This is a very common choice for foreign key fields. Now, very quickly, what does this actually do? It means that if a director is deleted from the database, and this is why it's called on delete, that means that some movies might have a reference that is no longer valid to that director. And that's not acceptable in a database. That is a breach of referential integrity, if you want to get technical. You cannot have dangling foreign key pointers to things that no longer exist. And what happens when you set it to models.cascade is that any movie that references that deleted director ID is also going to be removed from the database. There are other options here. For example, you could set it to null if the field is nullable, and you could set it to a default value as well. But what we have here in our new options in Django is the ability to set it to database level options, DB cascade, DB set null, and set default. So let's just do that just now. We're going to set this to DB_cascade. So this is only in Django 6.1 and above. Now, because this is a database level operation, what you need to do is you need to run the make migrations command. So I'm going to go to the terminal here, and let's clear this terminal. I'm going to run uv-run manage.py, and it's make migrations. And that's going to add this new migration, and then we can run the migrate command. So uv-run manage.py migrate. That will change the underlying database. And what we can then do is we can demonstrate this. I'm just going to do this on the Django shell. So uv-run manage.py shell, we're going to run that command, and that will open the Django shell. So let's grab a director from the database using director.objects.first. And that is going to give us the first director in the database table. In this case, it happens to be Stanley Kubrick. And what's going to happen if we call director.delete here? Let's execute this, and you can see it's removed that director. And after deleting Stanley Kubrick from the database, we are also going to remove all movies that have a foreign key pointer to that director. And that's because we've now set this to DB_cascade. It would have happened anyway using models.cascade, but this is now going to be a database level operation. So if we go back to our application here, we can refresh this page, and I'm still getting this field fetch block. Let's go back to views.py, and we can set this back to fetch_peers. After we've done that, let's save and go back here, and we're going to see that we no longer have any films by Stanley Kubrick. So when that director was deleted, there was a database level cascade to delete all of the associated movies. And if I refresh that again, you can see it's removed the other director, and we're left with only Martin Scorsese. And we're now using that DB cascade method. So we now have these database level options for the foreign key.onDelete. And the other big change, of course, as we mentioned earlier, is the new mailers setting. So we can now have multiple email clients and backends configured in the application. And this will be the way that you set these up and set up email backends going forward in Django from this release. So even though this is a minor release, I think there's some cool features coming up in Django here, and I'm excited to see what they do after this. And like I said earlier, for the minor features that we have at the bottom here, if you'd like to see any of these covered in any detail, let me know in the comments. I don't think there are any massive changes here that really can be covered, but let me know in the comments if you see anything cool. And otherwise, that's going to be all for this video. If you've enjoyed the video, let me know in the comments. And if you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page. And don't forget to like and subscribe as well. And if you'd like to know more about building apps with HTMX, check out our Udemy course. We've got a link just below in the comments. And thanks again for watching. We'll see you soon in the next video.